Hello, welcome to Know About History channel. Hope you like it.
The strategic trajectory of the Second World War is frequently analyzed through the lens of dramatic terrestrial battles or the sheer scale of industrial output, yet the most decisive factor in the eventual collapse of the Third Reich was not the physical destruction of its factories or the leveling of its cities, but the systematic strangulation of its liquid fuel supply. While the Allied strategic bombing campaign, characterized by the devastating area bombing of cities like Hamburg and Dresden, caused immense civilian loss and social disruption, it was the targeted and late war shift to the oil campaign that rendered the German military a hollow shell. To understand how a shortage of fuel crippled the Wehrmacht more effectively than the thousands of tons of high explosives dropped on its urban centers, one must first analyze the fundamental chemical and economic infrastructure upon which the Nazi war machine was built. Germany entered the conflict in 1939 with a structural energy paradox. It was a global leader in chemical engineering and coal production but possessed virtually no domestic petroleum reserves. The German economy was almost entirely coal-based, a reality that dictated the Reich's military strategy from the outset. Adolf Hitler and the planners of the Four-Year Plan, led by Hermann Göring, were acutely aware that a motorized, modern conflict required vast quantities of gasoline, diesel, and aviation spirit, resources that Germany could only acquire through two precarious methods: high-risk imports or the technologically brilliant but prohibitively expensive process of synthetic fuel production. The development of the synthetic fuel industry, spearheaded by the chemical giant IG Farben, was perhaps the greatest industrial achievement of the Third Reich, yet it simultaneously created its greatest vulnerability. Through the Burgess process of high-pressure hydrogenation, German scientists were able to convert lignite and bituminous coal into high-grade liquid fuels. By 1939, synthetic plants like the massive complex at Leuna were already providing a significant percentage of the Luftwaffe's aviation gasoline. However, these plants were not merely industrial sites, they were sprawling, intricate chemical cathedrals that were notoriously difficult to build and even harder to repair. The process required immense pressures and temperatures, necessitating specialized steel alloys and precision engineering. This centralization meant that while the German army could decentralize its tank production across hundreds of small workshops, it could not decentralize the production of the fuel required to move those tanks. The synthetic plants were bottleneck targets. If the Allies could sever the flow of hydrogen and the specialized catalysts used in these plants, the entire motorized capability of the Reich would eventually grind to a halt. During the early years of the war, specifically the campaigns in Poland, the Low Countries, and France, the fuel crisis was largely obscured by the speed of the German advance. The Blitzkrieg was designed precisely to win wars before the lack of resources became a factor. In 1940, the Wehrmacht captured significant French fuel stocks, which provided a temporary reprieve. However, the decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941, known as Operation Barbarossa, brought the fuel reality back into sharp, terrifying focus. The German General Staff had planned for a campaign of 6 to 8 weeks, a time frame during which their existing stockpiles would suffice. They did not account for the sheer physical distance of the Russian steppe or the fact that a motorized division in the east consumed significantly more fuel per mile due to the lack of paved roads and the constant need to operate in low gears through mud and snow. By August 1941, the German spearheads were frequently forced to halt for days at a time, not because of Soviet counterattacks, but because the logistics of the void had failed. The supply trucks, which were themselves heavy consumers of fuel, could not carry enough gasoline to the front lines while also carrying the fuel needed for their own return journeys. This logistical tail was the invisible tether that prevented the capture of Moscow. The year 1942 was defined by Hitler's desperate gamble to solve the oil problem once and for all. Operation Blue, the summer offensive into southern Russia, was driven almost entirely by the need to capture the Caucasian oil fields at Maikop, Grozny, and ultimately Baku. Hitler famously told his generals that if he did not get the oil of the Caucasus, he must end the war. This was not hyperbole but a cold assessment of the Reich's industrial reality. The failure of the 1942 campaign, culminating in the disaster at Stalingrad, meant that Germany would never possess the natural petroleum reserves necessary to sustain a global war against the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union simultaneously. From early 1943 onwards, the German military was living on a fuel deficit, where consumption almost always exceeded production plus imports from Romania. The Romanian oil fields at Ploiești were the Reich's only significant source of natural crude, and their defense became the highest priority of the German High Command. When the American 15th Air Force began bombing Ploiești in earnest during 1943 and 1944, the impact was felt immediately in every panzer division across Europe. However, the true turning point in the air war was not the destruction of cities, but the decision by General Karl Spaatz of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces to prioritize the German synthetic oil industry above all else. This shift, which began in May 1944, is often cited by historians as the most effective application of air power in history. While Air Chief Marshal Arthur "Bomber" Harris of the RAF remained convinced that, dehousing the German worker would win the war, Spaatz and his analysts recognized that the German military was a machine that required blood, and that blood was oil. On May 12, 1944, over 800 American bombers struck several major synthetic plants, including Leuna, Brux, and Zeitz. The results were catastrophic for the German war effort. In a single day, a significant portion of Germany's fuel production capacity was knocked offline. Unlike a city, which could function even with half its buildings destroyed, a synthetic oil plant was a delicate ecosystem. If the high-pressure pipes were severed or the cooling towers collapsed, the entire production cycle stopped. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, later wrote that on that day, the technological war was lost. He informed Hitler that the systematic destruction of the oil plants would mean the end of the Luftwaffe and the grounding of the panzer divisions within months. The impact of the fuel shortage on the Luftwaffe was particularly devastating and serves as a prime example of how fuel lack crippled the military more than direct bombing of aircraft factories. By late 1944, German factories were actually producing more fighter aircraft than at any other point in the war. The Fighter Staff program had successfully decentralized production, moving assembly lines into salt mines and forests. However, these thousands of new Mi-109s and FW-190s sat idle on airfields because there was no aviation gasoline, J2 or B4, to fly them. More importantly, the fuel shortage had forced the Luftwaffe to drastically reduce pilot training. While American and British pilots were entering combat with 300 to 400 hours of flight time, German novices were being sent into the sky with as little as 40 or 50 hours because the Reich could not afford to waste fuel on training flights. This resulted in a catastrophic decline in pilot quality, leading to a situation where even the most advanced aircraft, such as the Mi-262 jet fighter, were shot down by piston-engine Allied planes because the German pilots lacked the experience to handle their machines. The Luftwaffe did not lose the war because it ran out of planes, it lost because it ran out of the fuel to fly them and the fuel to train the men to fly them. On the ground, the fuel crisis fundamentally altered German tactical doctrine. The very essence of the German military was Bewegungskrieg, or the war of maneuver. This required the rapid movement of armored formations to achieve local superiority and encircle the enemy. By the summer of 1944, this was no longer possible. Panzer divisions were often used as static fire brigades, moved only when absolutely necessary and often towed by horses or oxen to their jumping-off points to save every drop of gasoline. During the Normandy campaign, many German units were unable to reach the invasion beaches in time to launch a decisive counterattack because Allied air interdiction and the lack of fuel forced them to move only at night and via circuitous routes. When the Germans launched their last great offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, the entire operational plan was predicated on the capture of Allied fuel dumps. The elite 1st SS Panzer Division, led by Joachim Peiper, was literally running on empty. Their advance stalled not necessarily because of American resistance at every point, but because their Tiger II tanks, which consumed an astronomical amount of fuel, ran dry on the narrow roads of the Ardennes. The sight of abandoned, perfectly functional German tanks on the roadsides of Belgium remains one of the most poignant symbols of the fuel shortage's impact. These vehicles were not destroyed by bombs or anti-tank guns, they were defeated by the empty gas tank. Furthermore, the fuel shortage created a ripple effect through the entire German industrial economy. The synthetic oil plants were also the primary producers of synthetic rubber, buna, and nitrogen for explosives. When the oil plants were bombed, the production of tires for trucks and gunpowder for artillery also plummeted. This interconnectedness meant that the oil campaign was actually a campaign against the entire German ability to wage war. By early 1945, the situation had reached a point of absurdity. The German railway system, the Reichsbahn, which relied on coal-fired locomotives, was failing because it lacked the lubricants, derived from oil, to keep the engines running. The lack of diesel fuel meant that the U-boat fleet, once the "grey wolves" of the Atlantic, was confined to port or forced to engage in suicidal missions with insufficient sea trials. The German military had become a stationary army in an age of total mobility. This lack of mobility made the German forces easy targets for Allied artillery and tactical air power. A tank that cannot move is merely a bunker, and a bunker can be bypassed or systematically demolished. In contrast, the Allied strategic bombing of cities, while destructive, often failed to achieve its primary objective of breaking the German wool or stopping production. Studies conducted after the war, such as the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, USSBS, revealed that German industrial production actually continued to rise through much of 1944 despite the massive raids on urban centers. Workers became accustomed to the raids, and machinery was often easily salvaged from rubble. However, the survey was unequivocal regarding the oil industry. The attacks on the refineries and synthetic plants were the decisive blow. The survey noted that by January 1945, German fuel production was only 5% of its peak 1944 levels. No amount of propaganda or civilian resilience could compensate for the fact that the engines of the Reich had no fuel. The shortage of fuel also had a profound psychological impact on the German leadership. It created a sense of technological impotence. Hitler's fascination with Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons, like the V-2 rocket, was partly a response to the fuel crisis. The V-2 used alcohol and liquid oxygen, fuels that were slightly easier to produce than high-octane gasoline. Yet even these programs were eventually strangled by the collapse of the energy infrastructure. The logistical collapse caused by the fuel shortage also meant that the German army could no longer effectively distribute food or medical supplies to its own soldiers or the civilian population. The breakdown of motorized transport led to a reliance on the horse, an animal that required massive amounts of fodder, which in turn took up valuable space on the few functioning railway lines. The Wehrmacht of 1945 was, in many ways, more primitive than the army of 1914. It was an army that had been stripped of the advantages of the Industrial Revolution. When historians debate why the German defense of the West collapsed so rapidly after the breakout from Normandy, or why the Red Army was able to tear through the Vistula-Oder line in weeks, the answer invariably returns to the lack of operational mobility. The Germans could not move their reserves to meet the breakthroughs. They were pinned in place, and in modern warfare, the stationary side is the losing side. Ultimately, the fuel shortage acted as a force multiplier for every other Allied advantage. It made the Allied air superiority absolute, it made the Soviet manpower advantage insurmountable, and it made the American industrial output devastating. If the Allies had focused on the oil industry in 1942 instead of 1944, the war in Europe might have ended a year earlier. The German experience proves that in a mechanized age, oil is the literal and metaphorical lifeblood of sovereignty. The bombs that fell on Berlin caused fire and death, but the bombs that fell on the Leuna chemical works caused the paralysis and death of the Nazi state. The German soldier was often better trained and his equipment often superior in quality to that of his opponents, but without the means to power his machines, he was reduced to a spectator in his own defeat. The failure of the German fuel strategy was a failure of grand strategy. A nation that chooses to fight a war of movement without securing a guaranteed source of energy is a nation that has already decided its own fate. The oil campaign did not just win the war. It proved that the modern battlefield is won in the refinery as much as in the trench. By the time the Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag, the German military had already been dead for months, its heart stopped by the simple absence of gasoline. The chemical complexity of the synthetic fuel program cannot be overstated, as it represents the extreme measures the German state was forced to take. The Fischer-Tropsch and Burgess processes were not merely industrial footnotes, they were the central pillars of the Nazi autarky policy. These processes required a massive input of electricity and manpower, often provided by slave labor from concentration camps like Monowitz, Auschwitz III, which was specifically built to provide workers for an IG Farben synthetic rubber and fuel plant. The moral bankruptcy of the regime was thus deeply intertwined with its energy desperation. The failure of these plants under Allied bombardment was not just a technical failure but the collapse of the entire economic ideology of the Reich. When the specialized engineers and technicians were killed or when the precision equipment was destroyed, Germany had no way to replace them under the pressure of total war. The decentralized nature of other industries allowed for a resilience of the rubble, but the oil industry was too sophisticated to survive in a shattered landscape. This vulnerability was the single most important strategic intelligence discovery of the war for the Allies. The comparison between the impact of fuel shortages and the impact of bombs also extends to the realm of the logistical shadow. Every liter of fuel diverted to the front was a liter taken away from the internal transport of coal, which was needed for the very synthetic plants producing the fuel. This created a death spiral of energy. By the winter of 1944-45, the German state was cannibalizing its own infrastructure just to keep a few Panther tanks moving in the east. The decision to prioritize the production of fighter planes over the production of fuel-hauling trucks was another strategic error that compounded the crisis. Even if fuel was produced at a plant in the Ruhr, getting it to a tank division in East Prussia was an almost impossible task due to the destruction of the canal and rail networks. The German army was suffocated by its own complexity and the lack of a basic, liquid commodity. This reality stands as a stark reminder to military analysts that tactical brilliance, which the Germans certainly possessed in spades, is entirely subordinate to the mundane, often overlooked reality of fuel logistics. The bombs that hit the cities were a tragedy, but the fuel shortage was a tragedy from which there was no recovery. It was the silent, invisible killer of the Third Reich. As the war entered its final months, the desperation for fuel led to the implementation of the Geilenberg program, an emergency effort to move synthetic oil production underground. Thousands of workers were forced to tunnel into mountains to create bomb-proof refineries. While an engineering feat, it was far too little and far too late. The output of these underground facilities was a mere fraction of what was required. By the spring of 1945, the German High Command was reduced to ordering that aircraft be towed to the runways by teams of horses to conserve the few liters of fuel needed for the takeoff itself. In the end, the most powerful military machine the world had ever seen was brought to its knees by the simplest of needs. The shortage of fuel was not just a factor in the defeat, it was the mechanism of the defeat itself, proving that in the age of the internal combustion engine, the true master of the battlefield is the one who controls the flow of oil. The Allied victory was a victory of the gas pump over the Tiger tank, a victory of strategic foresight over tactical obsession. The ruins of the synthetic oil plants at the end of the war were the true monuments to the fall of Nazi Germany, far more significant than the scorched shells of the cities. They represented the end of an era where a resource-poor nation could hope to dominate the world through military skill alone, signaling the dawn of a new geopolitical reality where energy security and military power are one and the same. The impact on the civilian sector also fed back into the military collapse. The Holzgas, or wood gas generators that became common on civilian cars, were also fitted to many military training vehicles and transport trucks. These systems worked by heating wood to create a combustible gas, but they were notoriously unreliable, produced significantly less power, and required constant maintenance. This degradation of the transport fleet meant that the German rear areas were in a state of constant logistical friction. When the Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945, the German units were unable to conduct an organized retreat because their gasogen trucks could not navigate the winter roads and their tanks were out of fuel. Thousands of vehicles were simply abandoned and blown up by their own crews. This loss of equipment was greater than anything suffered in the major battles of the preceding years. The fuel shortage had turned the Wehrmacht into a disposable army. Once it moved forward, it could never move back. It was a one-way military. Even the development of the revolutionary Type 21 U-boat, which could have potentially restarted the Battle of the Atlantic, was hampered by the fuel crisis. These submarines required high-quality diesel and specialized chemical fuels for their advanced propulsion systems. Because the production of these fuels was tied to the same synthetic plants being hammered by the 8th Air Force, the Type 21 never became the threat it was intended to be. The history of the German war effort from 1944 onwards is a history of what-ifs, that were all answered by the same reality: there was no oil. If the Me-262 had been available in thousands with trained pilots and fuel, the Allied bombing might have been stopped. If the panzer divisions had been able to maneuver in Normandy, the invasion might have been thrown back into the sea. But all these ifs depended on a resource that Germany did not have and could not protect. The Allied strategy of targeting the oil industry was the ultimate checkmate. It targeted the one thing the Germans could not substitute, could not fix, and could not hide. In the final analysis, the oil campaign was the most successful strategic application of air power because it targeted the Achilles heel of the German industrial system. While the bombing of cities was a blunt instrument that often backfired by stiffening civilian resolve, the bombing of the oil plants was a surgical strike that paralyzed the military. It was the difference between hitting a boxer in the face and cutting the tendons in his legs. The boxer might still be angry and willing to fight, but he can no longer stand or throw a punch. Germany in 1945 was that boxer. The fuel shortage was the primary cause of the Reich's military impotence, making it the most significant factor in the Allied victory in Europe, surpassing the impact of every other form of bombardment. The lessons of this energy-driven defeat continue to resonate in modern military theory, emphasizing that no amount of technology can compensate for a broken supply chain and an empty fuel tank. The silence of the German panzers in the spring of 1945 was the final proof that the war was won not by those who could build the best machines, but by those who could keep them running. This fundamental truth of industrial warfare remains the most important legacy of the conflict's logistical history, illustrating that the most powerful weapon in the Allied arsenal was not the bomb, but the ability to deny the enemy the fuel to resist. The German military's reliance on coal-to-liquid technology also meant that their fuel was often of a different chemical composition than Allied petroleum-based fuels. German aviation gasoline, for example, had a high aromatic content which was necessary to achieve high-octane ratings without the lead additives that the Allies used in abundance. This made the German fuel more finicky and harder to store for long periods, as it tended to degrade. When the refineries were bombed, the remaining stockpiles of this specialized fuel became even more precious and harder to distribute. The logistical nightmare of managing several different types of synthetic and natural fuels, often incompatible with one another, added another layer of friction to the German war effort. It was a system that worked only under perfect conditions, and by 1944, conditions were anything but perfect. The collapse of the fuel system was therefore not just a matter of quantity, but of the entire chemical infrastructure of the state. When we examine the records of the OKH, Oberkommando des Heers, and the OKW from the final year of the war, the obsession with fuel is the dominant theme. Every operational order, every defensive plan, and every strategic retreat was dictated by the tons of fuel available. The great German generals, like Rommel or Manstein, who had built their reputations on speed and daring, would have been unrecognizable in the context of 1945. They were reduced to counting liters and calculating the distance between fuel depots. The death of the Wehrmacht was not a single event but a slow, agonizing process of starvation. The shortage of fuel was the ultimate friction, in the Clausewitzian sense, that made every simple movement difficult and every difficult movement impossible. It was the primary reason why the German army, despite its formidable reputation and technical expertise, was unable to prevent the total occupation of its homeland. The bombs destroyed the structures of the Reich, but the fuel shortage destroyed its ability to defend them, making it the most critical and decisive element in the Allied path to victory.